At 85 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. Wars, recessions, raising 2 sons into fine men, and outliving most of my friends, none of it had prepared me for the cold reality I discovered that night. Elizabeth, my wife of 50 years, sat across the room, smiling faintly at her phone. At 67, she still had that charm that turned heads at every gala we attended, but lately, her attention had been elsewhere. She laughed more at her screen than she ever did at my stories. She left the room to pour herself another glass of wine, and her phone buzzed on the coffee table. I leaned over. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but the name on the screen was clear as day, Gary. Gary? There was no Gary in our circle, no Gary among her charity boards, no Gary mentioned at our dinner table. A second message popped up. Counting down the hours, beautiful. You were incredible last night. See you tomorrow at 7? I picked up the phone. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a joke. This was betrayal. Cold, calculated, disgusting betrayal. When she returned, I handed her the glass she had poured and smiled like nothing had happened. Busy tonight? I asked casually. Just chatting with the ladies, she replied, too quickly. I noted the slight tremor in her voice. I didn't let it show, but I felt nothing but disdain. She thought I was a relic, a man who wouldn't notice her deceptions. 50 years of marriage, and she believed I was too weak to act? She had no idea who she was dealing with. By the time she went to bed, I had already set my plan in motion. Her phone was mine for the next 2 hours. I transferred every message, every photo, every conversation with Gary to my laptop. Their meeting places, their little jokes, and the lies she had told to cover her tracks, I had it all. But I didn't stop there. I found Gary's social media profiles, his business connections, his family. This wasn't just about her anymore. No, they would both pay for this. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end for her little fantasy. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee as Elizabeth bustled around, preparing for another one of her errands. She had perfected the role of the devoted wife over 5 decades, but now I saw through her facade. The way she avoided my gaze, her overly cheerful tone, it all reeked of guilt. Heading out early today? I asked, setting my mug down. She smiled, but her eyes darted to the clock. Yes, I have a meeting with the charity board, and it might run late. Don't wait up for dinner. Charity board. I almost laughed at the audacity. She wasn't going to meet any board. She was meeting Gary, the man who had the gall to call my wife beautiful and boast about their stolen nights together. Take care, I said evenly, watching her grab her purse and disappear out the door. The moment I heard her car engine roar to life, I pulled out my phone. The tracking app one had installed last night showed her heading straight to the golf course, a detail she had conveniently omitted. I had no intention of confronting her there. That would be too simple, too messy. This wasn't about an emotional outburst or some cheap confrontation. No, I was going to dismantle her fantasy piece by piece, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but regret. First, I needed to know more about Gary. What kind of man interferes in a 50-year marriage? A man with no principles, clearly. But there was always more to it. Men like Gary always had weaknesses, and I was determined to exploit his to the fullest. Pulling up his social media profile, I studied every detail. Gary was 58, a real estate developer with a carefully curated online presence, at charity events, vacations, and a parade of posts showing his generosity. A public persona like that had cracks, it was just a matter of finding them. I noticed something interesting. Gary worked with a company that had recently been implicated in a zoning scandal. Whispers of bribes and falsified permits swirled in the media, but no one had pointed fingers directly at him yet. Perfect. I made a few calls to some old contacts. Age and experience have their perks, and one of mine was a close friend who worked in local investigative journalism. Within an hour, I had all the information I needed. Gary wasn't just involved in the scandal, he was at its center. This was gold. But I wasn't going to use it just yet. Timing was everything. By the time Elizabeth returned home that evening, I had already compiled a dossier on her lover. Every shady deal, every tax discrepancy, every inconsistency in his carefully constructed life, it was all there, waiting to be deployed. She walked in, greeted me with the same fake smile, and asked about my day. I responded with polite indifference, my mind already focused on the next step. "How was the charity meeting?" I asked, barely glancing up from my newspaper. "It was productive," she lied, hanging up her coat. "We're planning a fundraiser next month." "Sounds exciting," I said. "Let me know how I can help." The sheer audacity of her deceit would have enraged a younger man, but I wasn't about to lose control. That's exactly what she would expect, a confrontation, an argument, maybe even tears. But that wasn't me. Not anymore. The next day, I took action. I visited my attorney, a no-nonsense professional who had handled several of my business disputes in the past. I presented him with everything I had, texts, photos, even her financial records that showed recent unexplained withdrawals. "I want to secure everything," I told him. "The house, the accounts, my investments, lock it all down." "She gets nothing." He nodded, impressed by my preparation. "We'll move quickly. But this will require discretion." "Discretion is the least of my concerns," I replied. "Just make it happen." That afternoon, I made another call to the HR department of Gary's company. Pretending to be a concerned neighbor, I hinted at his involvement in the zoning scandal. They thanked me for the tip and assured me they would look into it. I knew what that meant. Gary's life was about to become a lot more complicated. When I returned home, Elizabeth was on the phone, her back to me as she spoke in hushed tones. I stood in the doorway, silently listening. "Yes, I can meet you tomorrow," she said, her voice low and urgent. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Just keep your phone off when we're together. I don't want to take any chances." The irony of her confidence almost made me laugh. She thought she was in control, that I was oblivious. In reality, I was 10 steps ahead. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, the facade she had so carefully constructed would come crashing down. Tomorrow, I'd take the next step. This wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about ensuring she and Gary felt the full weight of their betrayal. The morning after I overheard Elizabeth's whispered conversation with Gary, I knew it was time to escalate. By now, I had gathered enough evidence to destroy her carefully constructed facade, but my plan was far from over. Ruining her wasn't enough, I needed Gary to feel the full weight of his decisions as well. Elizabeth left the house early, dressed a little too elegantly for her supposed charity meetings. The red scarf she wore, a gift from me on our 40th anniversary, felt like an insult now. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, tracking her movements through the app. As expected, she was heading straight to Gary's favorite cafe downtown. Once she was out of sight, I began preparing. The photos, messages, and financial records I had gathered over the past few days were organized into separate folders. One for my attorney. One for Gary's company. And one for our children. I wasn't just going to confront her privately, this betrayal deserved an audience. After securing the files, I drove to the address I had found for Gary's office. His real estate firm occupied a sleek, glass-walled building in the business district. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'm here to drop off some documents for Mr. Gary Thompson," I said, handing her the envelope. It contained an anonymous tip about his involvement in the zoning scandal, complete with copies of financial transactions linking him to illegal deals. "These are highly confidential," I added. Make sure they get to him directly. She nodded, her professional demeanor slipping slightly as she glanced at the bold letters on the envelope, "Attention, at Board of Directors." With that done, I returned to my car and made my next call, to a friend at the local news station. "Remember that zoning scandal you've been sniffing around? I've got the missing pieces," I said. By the time Elizabeth returned home that evening, I had already moved to the next phase of my plan. She walked through the door with that same fake smile, as though everything was normal. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Exhausting," she replied, setting her purse on the counter. "The charity board is really pushing for a big fundraiser this year." I nodded, not letting on that I already knew the truth. The next morning, she left again, this time heading to a private hotel where Gary was waiting. This was the final piece I needed. I had hired a private investigator to tail her, ensuring every detail of her affair was documented. By noon, I had photos of them entering the hotel together, laughing as though they had no care in the world. That evening, I called our two sons, Robert and Mark, and asked them to come over for dinner the following night. "It's important," I told them. "Something we need to discuss as a family." When Elizabeth asked about the dinner, I told her it was to celebrate Mark's recent promotion. She smiled, completely unaware of what was coming. The following evening, the house was warm with the aroma of roasted chicken and baked potatoes. I had made sure everything looked as normal as possible. Robert and Mark arrived right on time, joking with each other as they sat down at the table. Elizabeth played the perfect hostess, pouring wine and laughing at their stories. It almost made me sick to watch her act as though nothing had changed. Halfway through dinner, I set down my fork and cleared my throat. "There's something I need to share with all of you," I began, my voice steady. Elizabeth looked at me curiously, her smile faltering. I pulled out the folder of evidence and placed it on the table. "These past few weeks, I've uncovered something that has shaken the very foundation of our family. Elizabeth, I know about Gary." The color drained from her face. What are you talking about?" I opened the folder, revealing the photos, messages, and receipts. "This," I said, sliding the evidence toward her. "You've been lying to me. To all of us." Mark and Robert sat frozen, their eyes darting between their mother and the evidence. "Gary Thompson," I continued, addressing them now. "The man your mother has been seeing behind my back. A man half her age, whose entire career is built on lies and corruption." Elizabeth stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Henry, I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted sharply. "Don't insult me with excuses. I've given you 50 years of loyalty, and this is how you repay me?" The room fell into a tense silence. Mark was the first to speak. "Is this true, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Elizabeth couldn't meet his gaze. "I've already taken steps," I said, addressing my sons. "The house, the accounts, everything is secure. She gets nothing." Robert leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "I can't believe this." Elizabeth reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "You made your choice, Elizabeth. Now live with it." I stood, leaving her sobbing at the table. "Dinner's over," I said. "You can pack your things tonight." As I walked out of the dining room, I felt a cold satisfaction. This was only the beginning. As I left Elizabeth sobbing at the dinner table, I felt no guilt. Her tears were meaningless to me now, a weak attempt to manipulate the situation. She had gambled with our 50 years of marriage, and I was determined to show her just how high the stakes were. The following morning, I began the next phase of my plan. While Elizabeth was still upstairs, likely crying in our bedroom, I called my attorney. "I want the divorce papers expedited," I said firmly. "I want to serve her today." My attorney, always efficient, assured me the documents would be ready within hours. I had already made sure every legal avenue was covered, the house was under my name, the accounts were secured, and I had withdrawn every shared asset we had. Elizabeth would have no financial safety net, no soft landing. After the call, I sent a locksmith to change every lock in the house. By noon, the front door, garage, and even the back patio had new, unbreakable locks installed. Elizabeth wouldn't be able to re-enter this house without my permission. While the locksmith worked, I retrieved the copy of the video footage my private investigator had taken of Elizabeth and Gary at the hotel. It was damning, intimate moments caught on camera, complete with timestamps and room numbers. I uploaded the files to a secure drive and prepared to use them if necessary. By midday, Elizabeth finally emerged from the bedroom. Her eyes were swollen, and she looked every bit the broken woman I intended her to become. "What are you doing, Henry?" she asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even look up from my coffee. Taking back control, I replied flatly. "You can't just lock me out of my own home," she said, her voice rising. "This was my home before it was yours," I shot back. "You forfeited any claim to it the moment you decided to betray me." She stood there, shaking with a mix of anger and fear. I could see her mind racing, trying to find an argument, a way to regain the upper hand. But there was no hand for her to play. "You don't understand," she began. "It was a mistake, Henry. A stupid, meaningless mistake." I stood up, towering over her, and pointed to the door. "Get out." She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "Please, we can fix this. We've been through so much together." "You should have thought of that before you brought Gary into our lives," I said coldly. When she didn't move, I grabbed her suitcase, the same one I had packed the night before, and handed it to her. "You have an hour to leave. Don't test me." Once she was gone, I turned my attention to Gary. The information I had sent to his company was already causing waves. My friend in local journalism confirmed that the media was preparing to break the story about Gary's involvement in the zoning scandal. But I wasn't done with him yet. Using the contact information I had gathered, I called Gary's wife. I introduced myself politely, explaining who I was and why I was calling. "I thought you should know," I said, my voice steady, "that your husband has been seeing my wife for months. I have evidence, photos, messages, and videos. If you'd like, I can send them to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then her voice, trembling with fury, said, "Send them. All of it." I complied, forwarding everything to her personal email. Her response came within minutes, "Thank you for telling me. He'll regret this." Good. Gary's life was beginning to crumble, and I was more than happy to give it a push. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on how quickly things had unraveled. Elizabeth had been a part of my life for so long that the house felt eerily quiet without her presence. But the silence didn't bother me. It was a reminder that I had taken back control. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from Robert, my eldest son. "I'm proud of you, Dad. She doesn't deserve you." For the first time in days, I allowed myself a small smile. My sons understood. They knew that betrayal couldn't be tolerated, not in a family built on loyalty and respect. The next morning, the divorce papers were ready. I personally delivered them to the hotel where Elizabeth was staying. I didn't bother to call her, I wanted her to be caught off guard. The hotel manager hesitated when I asked him to deliver the envelope, so I slipped him a generous tip. Moments later, I watched from the lobby as Elizabeth came downstairs, the papers clutched in her hands. Her expression shifted from confusion to devastation as she scanned the documents. She spotted me sitting in a nearby chair and approached, her voice trembling with desperation. "Henry, you don't have to do this." I stood, meeting her gaze without a hint of emotion. "Yes, I do." "You're throwing away 50 years, she cried. "No," I said firmly. You threw it away the moment you decided Gary was worth more than our life together. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the middle of the lobby. She could keep her tears and her excuses, and I was done. After walking out of the hotel, I didn't look back. Elizabeth's face, full of despair as she clutched the divorce papers, was burned into my memory. But it didn't stir pity in me, it only solidified my resolve. She had chosen to destroy our marriage, and now she would experience the consequences. When I returned home, the house felt more like my own than it had in years. Without Elizabeth's presence, there was no false cheer, no hidden lies lurking in the corners. It was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what I needed. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat down in my study, and turned my focus to the next part of my plan, dismantling Gary's life. My phone buzzed with a notification from my journalist contact. The story on Gary goes live tomorrow morning. It's going to hit hard. Good. That meant the local media would expose his role in the zoning scandal, tarnishing his carefully crafted reputation. But I wanted to take things further. Gary wasn't just a businessman, he was a self-proclaimed family man. His wife, his kids, and their pristine suburban life were all part of his public image. It was time to show them who he really was. I made a call to a private investigator I had worked with during my years in business. "I need you to follow up on Gary Thompson," I said. "Focus on his personal life. Find any skeletons he's hiding." The investigator assured me he'd have results within a few days. By the next morning, the media storm had begun. Every local news station and online platform was running the story of Gary's involvement in the zoning scandal. Photos of him shaking hands with city officials, emails implicating him in bribery schemes, it was all laid bare. Elizabeth called me just after noon. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "I told the truth," I replied calmly. "Isn't that what you and Gary always preached? Honesty and transparency? This is going too far, Henry. You're ruining lives." "Correction," I said coldly. "You and Gary ruined lives. I'm simply ensuring everyone knows the truth." I hung up before she could reply. Her protests didn't matter to me anymore. Later that afternoon, I received an update from the private investigator. Gary wasn't just an adulterer, he was a man with a gambling addiction. He had racked up significant debts in underground poker games, debts that he was struggling to hide from his wife and employers. Perfect. I contacted Gary's wife again, this time with proof of his gambling problem. Her fury was palpable even over the phone. "I'll handle this," she said through gritted teeth. "He won't have anything left when I'm done with him." I couldn't have planned it better myself. That evening, as I sat in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was Mark and Robert, my sons. "We wanted to check on you," Mark said as they stepped inside. I nodded, appreciating their concern. "I'm fine," I said, gesturing for them to sit. "Better than fine, actually." They exchanged uneasy glances. "Dad," Robert began, "this is intense. Are you sure this is what you want? To destroy Mom's life like this?" I leaned forward, meeting their eyes. "Your mother destroyed her own life the moment she chose Gary. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing this to ensure she can't manipulate or hurt anyone else." Mark nodded slowly. "We just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm better than I've been in years," I replied honestly. They stayed for a while, catching up and sharing stories about their own families. It was a reminder of what truly mattered, and the legacy I had built and the values I had instilled in them. The next day, I received word that Gary had been fired from his position at the real estate firm. His company couldn't afford the scandal, and his name had become toxic. Shortly after, his wife filed for divorce. Elizabeth tried to call me again, but I ignored her. She left a voicemail, sobbing and begging for forgiveness. "Henry, please. We can fix this. I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't throw everything away. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. She had thrown everything away the moment she chose deceit over loyalty. By the end of the week, my lawyer called to confirm that the divorce proceedings were moving quickly. She has no claim to the house or your accounts, he said. She's going to fight, but there's nothing she can do. Good, I replied. My last act of closure came that evening. I sat down with a pen and paper and wrote Elizabeth a letter. Elizabeth. 50 years ago, I promised to love, honor, and cherish you. I kept that promise through every challenge we faced. But love is built on trust, and you destroyed that. I don't hate you, I pity you. You had everything, and you threw it away for a fleeting thrill. I hope it was worth it, because now you'll have nothing. Henry. I mailed the letter the next morning. It was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. As I returned home, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The weight of betrayal was gone, replaced by the knowledge that I had taken back control of my life. The morning after I sent Elizabeth the letter, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The finality of it all, cutting her out of my life and dismantling her fantasy world, brought a strange kind of peace. But I wasn't done. Gary still had more to lose, and I wasn't going to stop until he felt the full weight of his betrayal. I checked my emails while sipping coffee in the study. The headlines were everywhere. Local real estate mogul exposed in zoning scandal. Gary Thompson resigns amid allegations of bribery. It was a beautiful sight. The man who had dared to insert himself into my marriage was now a pariah in his professional world. But his public humiliation wasn't enough. I opened the secure folder containing all the photos and messages Elizabeth and Gary had exchanged. My plan wasn't to release them publicly, that would have been too crude, too impulsive. Instead, I selected a few key pieces of evidence and forwarded them to every major client listed on Gary's company website. The message was simple. Dear client name. As a concerned member of this community, I feel it's my duty to inform you of the character of the man handling your investments. Please find attached evidence of Mr. Gary Thompson's personal and professional misconduct. Should you choose to continue working with him, you do so at your own risk. I clicked send, one email at a time, savoring the thought of Gary scrambling to salvage whatever scraps of his reputation remained. Later that day, I received a call from my private investigator. You were right about the gambling debts, he said. Gary owes over $200,000 to some very dangerous people. He's been using company funds to cover the payments, but he's running out of options. Good, I replied. Let them have him. The investigator hesitated. If he can't pay, they might do more than just threaten him. That's not my concern, I said coldly. Gary made his choices. He can deal with the consequences. I hung up, feeling no remorse. Men like Gary thrived on exploiting others, and now the tables were turning. By the end of the week, the fallout was in full swing. Elizabeth's attempts to contact me became increasingly desperate. She called multiple times a day, left long, rambling voicemails, and even sent a letter of her own. Henry, please. I know I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. Don't let 50 years end like this. I love you. Her words rang hollow. Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't sneak around in hotel rooms and lie about charity meetings. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames consume her empty promises. That evening, Robert and Mark came over again. They brought dinner and a few beers, determined to keep me company. You're handling this better than I expected, Mark said as he set the table. I've had time to prepare, I replied. This didn't happen overnight. Robert leaned against the counter, a thoughtful look on his face. What happens next? Next? I said, taking a sip of my beer. I rebuild. On my own terms. They nodded, clearly relieved to see that I wasn't drowning in self-pity. "Have you heard from Mom?" Robert asked hesitantly. "She's tried," I said, my tone firm. "But I've got nothing to say to her." Mark shook his head. "She brought this on herself." "Exactly," I said. "And I refuse to let her drag me down with her." The next morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from Gary's wife. "Henry. Thank you for sending me the evidence. I've confronted Gary, and he's finally admitted everything. I've filed for divorce and informed his creditors of his whereabouts. He has no one left to shield him now. If there's anything else I can do to help, let me know." I allowed myself a rare smile. Gary's empire was crumbling faster than I had anticipated. His debts, his marriage, his career, everything was falling apart. I replied briefly, "You've done more than enough. Good luck." With Gary out of the picture and Elizabeth cut off from my life, the weight on my shoulders grew lighter. But there was one last thing to address. I spent the afternoon preparing for a meeting with my attorney. The divorce proceedings were moving smoothly, but I wanted to ensure every loose end was tied up. By the time I arrived at his office, the paperwork was nearly complete. "Elizabeth's lawyer has filed a counterclaim," my attorney informed me. "She's requesting spousal support." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "On what grounds?" "Emotional distress," he said, smirking. "She claims your actions have left her financially and emotionally destitute." "She brought this on herself," I replied. "Make sure the judge sees the evidence of her affair. Every last detail." "Will do," he said. As I signed the final documents, a sense of closure washed over me. Elizabeth could fight all she wanted, but the outcome was inevitable. She had gambled everything, and she'd lost. That night, I sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The quiet was a welcome change, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The phone buzzed next to me, another call from Elizabeth. I let it go to voicemail. This time, there were no tears in her voice, only anger. "You'll regret this, Henry," she spat. "You think you're so righteous, but you're just a bitter old man. You'll die alone, and no one will care." I deleted the message and leaned back in my chair. Alone? No, I wasn't alone. I had my dignity, my freedom, and the knowledge that I had fought back. That was more than enough. When Elizabeth arrived the next afternoon, I watched her from the living room window as she hesitated at the edge of the driveway. Her once confident stride was gone, replaced by a nervous shuffle as though she was stepping onto a battlefield. And she was, though she didn't yet realize the battle was already lost. The knock on the door was soft, almost tentative. For a moment, I considered not answering, just to let her stand there and stew in her own anxiety. But I had planned this moment too carefully to leave it unfinished. I opened the door and stared at her silently for a beat too long. She looked older somehow, her makeup failing to hide the lines etched deeper into her face over the past few weeks. Gone was the polished image she had always maintained. What stood before me was a broken woman clinging to scraps of dignity. "Come in," I said flatly, turning and walking toward the dining room without waiting for her reply. The dining room table was ready. Laid out before us was the culmination of weeks of work, photos, messages, receipts, every shred of evidence that had brought us to this point. I gestured for her to sit, then took my place at the head of the table. She glanced at the pile, her face blanching as the reality of what was in front of her set in. "Henry," she began, but her voice faltered. "You asked to talk," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. "So talk." She sat down slowly, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "How about the beginning?" I suggested coldly. The part where you decided to betray 50 years of marriage for some cheap thrill. Her eyes welled up with tears, but I didn't flinch. I'd seen enough of her crying over the past few weeks to know it was nothing but theater. Henry, it wasn't like that, she stammered. I was lonely. You were so distant these past few years, and Gary. Don't, I interrupted, my voice rising. Don't you dare say his name in this house. You think you were lonely? Do you have any idea what it means to build a life with someone, to give them every piece of yourself, only to have them throw it away like it meant nothing? Her tears spilled over, but I wasn't moved. I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. I wasn't thinking clearly. You don't get to call this a mistake, I snapped. Forgetting a birthday is a mistake. Burning dinner is a mistake. What you did was a choice. Every lie you told, every text you sent, every meeting with him, it was deliberate. So don't stand there and insult me by pretending this was some lapse in judgment. She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. You lied to me, I continued, my voice steady and cold. You lied to our sons. You lied to yourself. And for what? For him? A man who's now facing criminal charges and whose wife has filed for divorce? Her head snapped up at that, her eyes widening. Gary's wife, she echoed. Yes, I said, leaning back in my chair. She knows everything. And she's handling him the way I'm handling you, by ensuring he loses everything. Elizabeth looked like she might collapse under the weight of my words. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the full scope of what she had done. Henry, she pleaded, her voice barely audible, please. I don't want to lose you. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I stood, towering over her. You don't get it, do you? There's nothing left to fix. You destroyed it all the moment you let him into our lives. I pointed to the door. This is the last time you'll ever set foot in this house. Take a good look around, because after today, it'll be nothing more than a memory. She hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no use. Slowly, she stood and walked toward the door, her steps unsteady. I followed her, making sure she didn't linger. When the door closed behind her, I felt the silence settle over the house. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was clean, like the air after a storm. I returned to the dining room and began clearing the table. The photos and papers went back into their folders, no longer needed. This chapter of my life was closed, and with it, the weight I had carried for weeks. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Elizabeth's betrayal had been a wound, but now it was nothing more than a scar. It would fade with time, and I would move forward. Alone, perhaps, but free. The house was eerily silent after Elizabeth left. For the first time in decades, there was no sound of her footsteps padding down the hall, no faint hum of her favorite oldies station playing in the kitchen. It was as if her absence had drained the air of familiar noise, leaving behind an unfamiliar quiet that I wasn't sure how to feel about. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the door she had walked out of for the last time. There was no regret, no second guessing. I had given her 50 years of loyalty, dedication, and love, and she had decided that wasn't enough. She had destroyed everything we had built together, and now she was living with the consequences. But even as I reassured myself that I'd made the right decision, there was an ache I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't for her. It was for the life we'd shared, for the memories that were now tainted by her betrayal. The next morning, I woke up early, as I always did, and brewed myself a pot of coffee. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the counter. I sipped my coffee slowly, staring at the tulip garden outside. It was overgrown and wild, a stark contrast to the orderly rows Elizabeth used to tend to so meticulously. I hadn't touched the garden since her affair came to light. Part of me wondered if it was because I wanted the chaos to match how I felt inside. But now, as I looked at it, I saw something different. The weeds weren't just a symbol of neglect, they were a reminder that life continued, even after it was uprooted. By mid-morning, I received a call from my lawyer. "Good news," he said. "The divorce papers have been delivered and filed. It's official, Elizabeth has no claim to your assets." "Good," I replied curtly. "I want everything finalized as soon as possible." "We're moving as quickly as the courts allow," he assured me. "But for now, you're in the clear. She won't be able to challenge this without significant resources, and from what I understand, she doesn't have any." After I hung up, I felt the weight on my shoulders lighten slightly. The legal side of things was under control, but I wasn't ready to move on completely. Not yet. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were buried. It wasn't a visit I made often, but something about the events of the past few weeks had stirred a need in me to reconnect with the past. Standing in front of their gravestones, I let out a slow breath. "Well," I said aloud, though no one was there to hear me, "it's done. 50 years, and she threw it all away. Can you believe that?" The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine. For a moment, I felt as though I could hear my father's voice, that steady baritone that had always been a source of guidance for me. "You did the right thing, son. Never let anyone take your dignity." I nodded to myself, the ache in my chest easing slightly. "I'm not sure what comes next," I admitted quietly. "But at least I'm free to figure it out." When I returned home, there was a package waiting on the porch. It was from Mark. He had sent me a framed photo of our family from years ago, taken during a summer barbecue. Elizabeth was in the picture, of course, but so were our sons, their faces lit with joy as they played in the backyard. I held the frame in my hands for a long moment before placing it on the mantel. The photo didn't feel tainted by what had happened. It was a reminder of a time when things were simpler, when our family felt whole. And even if that version of our life was gone, the memories still had value. That evening, I decided to tackle the tulip garden. The sun was setting as I stepped outside, shovel and gloves in hand. The earth was tough, hardened by weeks of neglect, but I dug in anyway. Pulling out the weeds, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. With each root I removed, it was as though I was clearing away a piece of the pain that had settled in my chest. As I worked, a neighbor passed by, her golden retriever trotting at her side. She stopped and waved, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Evening, Henry," she called. "It's good to see you out here. Those tulips will be beautiful again in no time." I nodded, wiping the sweat from my brow. "They've been neglected long enough. Time to fix that." Her smile widened. "Well, if you need help, let me know. I've got a green thumb, or so they tell me." I chuckled, watching her walk away. It was a small moment, but it reminded me that life went on. By the time I finished for the night, the garden was cleared, ready for new growth. As I stood back and surveyed the freshly turned soil, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Elizabeth's betrayal had been a storm, but storms didn't last forever. The damage was done, but the rebuilding had already begun. That night, as I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon, I let myself relax for the first time in weeks. The air was cool, the stars bright above me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't oppressive or heavy like it had been when Elizabeth was still here, spinning her web of lies. This was a lighter kind of quiet, the kind that follows a storm, when the air is fresh, and the sky feels open again. Still, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. After 50 years of living with someone, even their absence has a weight. The room seemed larger now, emptier. Every sound I made, footsteps, the clink of a coffee mug against the counter echoed just a little louder. That first morning, I wandered into the kitchen like I always did, out of habit more than anything else. The sunlight was already streaming through the windows, cutting across the table where we'd eaten countless breakfasts together. Her chair was still there, slightly askew, as if she might walk in and sit down any moment. I almost pulled it out to straighten it, but stopped myself. Instead, I grabbed my coffee and leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the tulip garden. Elizabeth used to spend hours out there, especially in the spring. She had this way of kneeling in the dirt, wearing that ridiculous floppy hat, humming some old tune while she worked. Back then, I used to think it was charming. Now, the sight of those overgrown weeds made my stomach turn. By mid-morning, I decided I couldn't sit in that house any longer. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for a while, letting the road take me wherever it wanted. I passed the park where we used to take the boys when they were little, then the library where Elizabeth volunteered for years. Eventually, I found myself at the diner on the edge of town. I hadn't been there in years, maybe not since the boys were in high school. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee hit me like a wave. "Henry?" I turned to see Sue standing behind the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and streaked with gray now, but her smile was the same. "Sue," I said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Long time." "Too long," she replied, pouring me a cup of coffee without asking. "How have you been?" I shrugged, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Still kicking," I said. "Not much else to say." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes still kicking is enough. Want some eggs? Bacon?" "Sure," I said. "Why not?" She didn't press for details, didn't ask the kind of questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Instead, she talked about the diner, the regulars, the changes in town. For a while, I just listened, letting her words fill the empty spaces in my mind. When I got back home, the house didn't feel as empty as it had that morning. The light coming through the windows felt warmer somehow, less harsh. I set my keys on the counter and glanced out at the garden again. It was a mess, wild, untamed, an eyesore compared to what it used to be. But for the first time, I didn't see it as her garden. It was mine now. I grabbed a pair of gloves and a shovel from the garage and went to work. The soil was hard, and the weeds fought me at every turn, but I didn't stop. Sweat dripped down my back as I yanked at roots, some of them so deep I had to dig with the shovel just to loosen them. Halfway through, a neighbor passed by with her dog. "Good to see you out here, Henry," she called, her voice cheerful. "Looks like the tulips are getting a second chance." I wiped my forehead with the back of my glove and managed a smile. "Figured it was time." She nodded. "They'll be beautiful again before you know it." I didn't say anything, just watched as she walked away, her golden retriever trotting happily at her side. By the time I finished for the day, the garden was cleared. The ground was bare, the rows neat and orderly, ready for planting. I stood back and surveyed my work, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. That evening, as I sat on the back porch with a glass of bourbon, I thought about the tulips. They wouldn't bloom right away, maybe not for months, but the foundation was there. All they needed was time. I thought about my life in the same way. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But the chaos was gone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The house felt different these days. The absence of Elizabeth wasn't just noticeable, it was everywhere. Her perfume no longer lingered faintly in the hallway. Her slippers weren't left at the foot of the bed. The creak of the floorboards sounded louder without her moving through the house. And yet, it wasn't bad. It wasn't good either, not yet, but it was something I could live with. I started to find small routines to fill the spaces that had once belonged to her. In the mornings, I took my coffee to the back porch, where I'd sit and watch the sunlight creep across the garden. The tulips were blooming now, their petals a bright contrast against the dark soil. It was a small victory, seeing them come back to life after so much neglect. It made me think, if flowers could survive the chaos of weeds and weather, maybe I could too. One day, I found myself in the attic. I hadn't planned to go up there. It was one of those places I avoided, full of boxes I hadn't touched in decades. But something about the afternoon made me restless, like I needed to confront the things I'd been ignoring. The attic smelled the same as it always had, a dust, dry wood, and a faint hint of something metallic. The boxes were stacked haphazardly, some of them sagging with age. I opened the nearest one and pulled out an old sweater, one I hadn't seen in years. Beneath it was a photo album. This one was older than the ones I'd gone through before. The pictures inside were from the early days of our marriage, our first apartment, the camping trips we took before the boys were born, the tiny Christmas tree we'd decorated with hand-me-down ornaments. I didn't feel the sting I'd expected. The memories didn't hurt, and they felt distant, like watching someone else's life play out on a faded screen. I closed the album and set it aside. Not everything from the past needed to come down with me. That weekend, Robert came by with the kids. They were older now, almost teenagers, but seeing them still brought the same warmth it always had. They ran through the house, their laughter echoing off the walls, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel empty. We grilled in the backyard, Robert standing next to me as I flipped burgers. "You've been keeping busy?" he asked, gesturing to the garden. I nodded. "It's good work. Keeps my hands moving, at least." He took a sip of his beer and glanced at me. "You seem different, Dad." "Lighter." "Maybe I am," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. After they left, the silence in the house didn't bother me. If anything, it felt earned, like a moment of rest after a long day. The next week, I found myself talking to the neighbor more often. Her golden retriever always trotted over to greet me when I worked in the garden, tail wagging like we were old friends. One day, she brought over a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. "These just came in," she said, handing me the basket. "Thought you might like some." "They look great," I replied, holding one up to inspect it. "Better than what I've been growing, that's for sure." She laughed, a warm, easy sound. "You'll get there. The tulips are proof of that." It wasn't much, a short conversation, a small kindness, but it reminded me that life wasn't all storms and betrayal. There were still good people out there, still good moments to be had. At night, I'd sit on the back porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the stars come out one by one. The tulips swayed gently in the breeze, their colors muted in the moonlight. I thought about Elizabeth sometimes, not with anger, but with a sense of finality. She was a chapter that had closed. The memories we'd made weren't all bad, but they were just that now, memories. As the bourbon warmed me, I thought about the future. It wasn't clear yet, but it didn't need to be. For the first time in years, the idea of starting over didn't feel daunting. It felt possible. And that was enough.